What up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Let's Ask Paul, the podcast where you get to ask me, Paul Abernathy, anything you want about the National Electrical Code or all things electrically related. Hell, you can ask me about bidding, estimating, HR, firing, hiring, whatever you want. If it's in the electrical industry and you have a question, feel free to go over to paulabernathy.com and submit your question. If it's selected, it will be used in an upcoming podcast, much like today. But I will answer via email. And if I don't answer you via email within a couple weeks, make sure you reach back out to me because I do get a lot of these. So I do want to make sure I answer all your questions. But before we get started today, I want to tell you that today's episode is sponsored by our latest and greatest offering out there. It's TradeHog. TradeHog is a tool that's designed for the contractor, plumbing, mechanical, building, it doesn't matter, HVAC technician, roofer, home inspector, municipal inspector, it doesn't matter. It is an artificial intelligence tool that you can use. It's designed to be very mobile friendly, and that was the key focus here, to be able to use it in the field to get quick solutions and answers, or at least give you a starting point that is very technical when it comes to certain questions on the job. So it's for field application. Now, we recently released an additional module that's included with TradeHog, and that is Office Hog, and that is for back-end stuff. You can ask it questions about marketing, taxes, ask it legal help, although we are not lawyers, so again, remember that. It'll give you basic information. It can create a marketing campaign. It can do all kinds of things that normal ChatGPT can do. The only difference is our models are trained towards our specialty, which is construction documents. And it's a neat feature. You can actually attach a document like a contract to it, and it will analyze it and ask it to bring back the key points and key topics or key summary of the document, and it'll do that for you. So this is some great things that we're offering over at tradehog.net. So go check that out. It is a subscription program. It is $19.95 a month for the basic plan, $29.95 a month for the premium plan. The only difference in the two is the amount of questions that you can ask it, that type of thing. That's the only limitation. Okay? All right. So check it out, tradehog.net. All right. So today's episode, we're going to tackle a question, and this question can be quite controversial for some people. Okay, so it's one of those things where you have to take this question and understand the concept of where we're coming from when it's being presented. And again, everybody's going to have varying opinions on this. Okay, so I'm just telling you that right up front. Right up front. I just want to clear the air up front. All right. So now remember, when you do send me these questions over at paulabernathy.com, make sure that you let me know the code cycle you're in, and that'd be more germane to the response because I want to keep it with the code cycle that you're working on. And, and that way I can make sure that I'm answering it, to your expectation. But again, remember, these are my opinions. You may agree to disagree. That's perfectly okay as well. Never said I was Nostradamus or even Tesla, Elon Musk, or I never said I was Nikola Tesla, all that kind of good stuff. I'm just me, electrician like you, who have been doing this for over 40 years. And I'm trying to give my best to help you understand the National Electrical Code and how things may apply. Okay, so this question was submitted, and I'm going to read you the question, and then I'll go back and I will pick through the question and try to answer some of these things that are involved in it. So I just want to make sure that I do that on the front end. So let me read the question first. It says, first point of disconnect is the main service panel. Traditionally, for PVC conduits carrying the service conductors from the panel to the meter pedestal, we ask for a green wire for continuity between the two. The argument recently made is that since the ground and the neutral are bonded at the panel, that running a separate ground is now splitting the neutral and creating an imbalance. Therefore, there should not be the green wire. Is this correct, and how is this different than using rigid pipe to bond it? Luckily, we recently switched to the 2020s, so all pedestals will have the first point of disconnect, I guess, and we'll eliminate this issue. Thanks for all your help. Okay, Thanks for the question. And we'll basically, let's dissect each one of these. Okay, the first statement is that the main service panel is always the first point of disconnect. Not always the case, okay? Not always the case, because you could have a situation where if you have 1 and 2 family dwelling, then you've got an issue where you may have what's called an emergency disconnect out there. So that may be your first point of actual disconnect, and it may or may not, may or may not be a service. And we find that under 230.85. That's emergency disconnect, 1 and 2 family dwellings. So that's a disconnecting means, but it might not be the first, that might be the first point, and it may or may not be service equipment. You got to go read 230.82 and see that there's some options for this when it comes to the disconnects. You can have a service disconnect, it could be a meter disconnect, or you could be some other listed disconnect switch there that doesn't change the fact that there's still service conductors. It's just a disconnect, that type of thing. Now, if it is service conductors and you have this disconnect, then everything on the load side of that will be feeder applications. But again, go look at 230.85 to understand emergency disconnect applications. Okay, so going with the premise that that we're talking about a service panel, and he's talking about between the meter and the service equipment, which again, we'll assume that it's outside because now you're required to have an emergency disconnect. And so we'll assume that service disconnect is also the emergency disconnect. And if they are in the 2020 code, then that would be required. If they're in the 2017 code, then the disconnect be outside or nearest point of entry. And there is no requirement for emergency disconnect in the 2017 NEC. So we'll assume that they're talking about the 2017 edition, which did not have that emergency disconnect requirement. Okay, assuming all that, a lot of assumptions there that I'm making on this episode. Okay, all right. Now the other argument he's saying is their jurisdiction requires them to run a green conductor for continuity between, or say a bonding jumper between the meter enclosure and the service enclosure. Okay. And so we're keeping the context to their question, assuming again, 2017, no emergency disconnect. So they get them to do this. And the question is being brought up, is that creating something like objectionable currents? Is that creating an imbalance in the neutral conductor? And the answer to that is 1, yes, it is creating an imbalance because current takes all available paths. Okay. It's not just the path of least resistance. It takes all available paths. And we're designing a system so that the current will travel back on the neutral conductor. Okay, it's going to always carry some amount of current, right? Not so for the metal parts. Even though they're connected together at each end, you have the meter, and then you have the neutral that's connected in the meter typically, and then you have the service panel, and the neutral is connected based on 250.24. It's connected in the service with the main bonding jumper to the enclosure. Okay, so they're connected. The neutral's connected at both ends. So, but the concept is you only want the return current back to the source to be traveling on that neutral grounded conductor, okay? That's what you want. And so in their situation, they are forcing people to put a green wire in there and obviously connecting it to the neutral at each end, which does create parallel paths, which does mean that you're going to have return current imbalance. Now, many people may look at that and say, well, if I have less current on the neutral, what's the problem? Well, that's because that wire you're installing for the green wire is a bonding component, okay? It really wasn't designed to carry the current, although now you're forcing it to do that. Now, it may be sized smaller than the neutral that you have already sized. If that's the case, if you lose your neutral, then your return current's going to be back on that green conductor that may not be sized properly. So that creates a problem. Now, if you have that green wire connected at each end to the neutral conductor and y'all are demanding that to take place, then what's happening is that you also are creating objectionable currents because you do have circulating currents that are traveling on the metal parts back to the source, not just through the grounded neutral conductor, but also through, obviously, this green wire. And you have basically forced them to construct a parallel path that can conceivably create objectionable currents. And it also is forcing an unnatural balance on the return current because it's going to take all available paths due proportional to the impedance of the path with the lowest impedance. Okay. Now, obviously, the bigger neutral, probably bigger than the green wire, is probably going to have a bigger conductor because you're sizing the neutral based on not smaller than 25102C1, plus you're taking into account the calculated load that'd be on that neutral. So maybe it is larger. And so the larger it is, it's going to carry more current, right? Logically, it's going to have lower resistance than the smaller green wire until you lose that neutral, and now you've got it traveling on the green wire, and that can create a problem, okay? Now, as far as the National Electrical Code is concerned, we have to construct circuits in a way that do not create objectionable current. And then the code in 250.6 tells us, you got to do something to mitigate this where possible. And so the first thing that I would say to mitigate this would be to remove that green wire. And remember that the National Electrical Code permits the use of the neutral conductor on the supply side to bond metal parts, bond that meter enclosure, and you're doing it in the panel by using the main bonding jumper and connected the grounded conductor to the enclosure. So you're doing it at the panel, and you're doing it at the meter for the most part. In most 1 and 2 family dwelling meters, the neutral conductor is connected to the enclosure. Now, you can easily test that out when you're doing an installation. Just use a continuity tester and touch the neutral terminal, and then go over and touch the enclosure. Usually use one of the threaded entries so you get rid of all of the paint issue. And you'll get a reading, and it should be continuity. That tells you that the neutral is inherently connected to the enclosure. If you're going to be running that green wire between the two, and if you're a jurisdiction that's forcing that, then you're forcing a violation of 250.6. You're forcing a potential issue of neutral return current traveling potentially on the green conductor, especially if there's a loose connection in the loose connection in the grounded neutral conductor. So you're introducing, or you're making them do things that potentially could cause issues. Okay. Now, the other thing that was asked in the question, this is, well, wait a minute, wouldn't this be the same if I had a meter and I went back to back with a rigid metal conduit and I'm connecting it to a panel enclosure? The short answer is yes, you are still creating an issue that could create objectionable current. Why? Because if the neutral grounded conductor is connected to the enclosure at the meter, and you're doing it per 250.24 at this service equipment, then you are inherently creating this same concept. Now, they're kind of asking, well, why do they allow it for the rigid, but we shouldn't allow it with the green wire? Well, I think the issue is that we've known for eons that it's a problem with using the rigid metal, intermediate metal, EMT between the meter and the panel, and then running a neutral through that and the way we bond at each end. What happens is we're creating this potential for an imbalance. We're creating this potential for parallel paths. We're doing all this, and the code is kind of tells you not to create objectionable currents, but it doesn't define what objectionable current is. But we know that it's basically objectionable current is current traveling on an unintended path, right? It is not designed to be traveling on the metal parts. But when you connect it to the neutral grounded conductor in the service, and you do it also at the meter, you are creating this potential. Now, this has been done forever. We tried to talk about this in Code Panel 5. We tried to come up with a objectionable current definition. We tried to do this. And people say, well, why don't you just flat out just require non-metallic type of raceways between it and you can solve that issue? Okay, well, we could, but you got to remember the NEC is not an instruction manual. It's just guiding you. And there's many options. For example, they do make transition fittings. Whereas if I'm using rigid, I can transition between the rigid to PVC. And I already know that the one end of the rigid's bonded because it's connected to the metal box on the panel side, but maybe it has a transition and it changes over to PVC as a fitting or as a coupling, and you get a transition fitting and it changes over, and so you break that connection. Well, then you've broken that parallel path. You still bonded the metal parts that enclose service conductors. Okay, we're following all of those rules in 250.92, but you're breaking that bond. And so you're separating it out. Also, you could have a meter that gives you the ability to not have the grounded neutral conductor connect to the actual enclosure. And then you wouldn't have a parallel path if you did run a green wire through there and connect it to the enclosure, okay? Because that neutral is isolated in the meter. That's options, but most of the time, traditional meters, that's not going to be the case. The grounded neutral conductor is bonded to the enclosure because 250.142 allows the neutral to be used to bond metal parts on the supply side of a service disconnect. So, there's no fancy dancy way around it. Do we see rigid used all the time on the supply side? Is it potentially a violation of 250.6? Sure. Do we see big problems with it? Not really. It's the touch potential thing that's helpful with the allowance of 250.142 and to use the grounded conductor at that application. But we're talking about different things when we're talking about return paths or creating parallel paths that cause current to travel on things that it wasn't intended for it to be. There's a lot more impedance on a metal enclosure and things like that than it would be on a direct conductor connecting from point A to point B. So current is going to take the path of all possible paths, but proportionately, it's going to take the path of least impedance proportionally. So the large majority of the amount of return current is going to travel on its intended path. And so we try to construct things that way. Just because you see people using rigid on the supply side and have a neutral inside of that raceway and the raceway and the neutral are bonded at each end, yes, they're technically creating a violation, but it's become an accepted practice. Now, when you force somebody to put a wire in a raceway to create that problem, that's different because the AHJs or municipalities should not be forcing these things on people. Because the only way that we can remove the 250.6 issue in this case is to remove that green wire. But then we have to ensure that if we do that and you're using PVC, for example, between the two, then we have to make sure that the meter enclosure is connected to the grounded neutral. Okay, and that may be, again, already inherent in the meter. But then obviously we're doing it on our service equipment. We're making sure we put that main bonding jumper in there and everything gets bonded together there, that type of thing. So I don't know if that answers your question that you presented, but again, it kind of gives you things to think about. Just because you see somebody using rigid doesn't make that right. It just people do it. But for a jurisdiction to force somebody to put a green wire in there and create parallel paths, to me is a little more intrusive than them constructing a rigid or intermediate or an EMT to protect the conductors on the supply side and inadvertently creating a potential of a 250.6 issue than it is to force somebody to put a wire in there and intentionally create this issue, that type of scenario, right? And we've also heard stories that raceways, for example, when we're doing like equipment grounding conductors, there was the Gemini study that was done, and I'm a conductor guy, don't get me wrong, but you notice that when it comes to raceways, we don't tell you how to size a raceway to clear an overcurrent device. If you're thinking about an equipment ground, we tell you how to size a conductor. We send you to 250.122 and you size it based on the overcurrent device. We give you that, but we don't give you instructions for the raceway. In other words, we don't tell you that a trade size half or 3/4 or 1 or 1 1/4 or 1 1/2 is going to carry a certain amount of current that's going to clear an overcurrent device. We just assume that it's going to. And so we don't really get into sizing there. So that's why some engineers that are in a pinch, they didn't size it right, the raceway right, and they got conductor fill issues. Well, they can remove the wire type equipment ground that they insisted on installing and use the metal raceway. If it qualifies in 250.118, then they can use it. And that way they can, get away with the raceway fill issue they may have introduced. So there's many ways to get around certain things, all compliant. The only downside to using a raceway as an equipment ground, for example, and I know I'm deviating from our original topic, but the only thing to ensure is that all the connections are made up tight, that you don't have any weakness in this raceway system, because obviously the raceway system is only as good as every termination, every coupling, every connector. And so, again, you have to do a little more due diligence to make sure that works. Whereas a wire is pretty straightforward, point A, point B, terminated and done. That's why more engineers just require an equipment ground of the wire type in a raceway than to use the raceway. I get it. But again, that's a little off topic because we're talking about on the supply side where you're not going to have an equipment ground because there's no overcurrent protection device up there. Get what I'm saying? All right. Anyway, hopefully that answered your question. I know you probably wanted me to give you definitive, but again, that's just how the code works and it's how it is. And there are certain practices that we do. And again, there was a reason that Code Panel 5 could not come up with objectionable current definition because we know that in certain cases, we're imposing something that would be contradictory to what we're trying to achieve. And so basically, the concept of objectionable current is we don't want current traveling on unintended paths. But we understand that there are certain applications in NEC that may introduce that. So we don't want to put something in writing that we can't truly be able to hang our hat on it as a definition. So we leave it pretty open. And so that's how you get my interpretation. That's how you'll get other people's interpretation of this, that type of thing. But that's the best I got for you. All right. All right, hopefully you got something out of that and something to take away from you. Again, make sure if you have any questions that you want to submit to us, just go to paulabernathy.com. We'd love to have you. And we'll catch you on an upcoming episode of Let's Ask Paul. Till next time, stay safe. God bless.